events in Russia. Excuse, I'm a little analogy. The situation began to develop as it did. I directed my national security team to monitor closely and report to me hour by hour. I instructed them to prepare for a range of scenarios. I also convened our key allies on a Zoom call to make sure we're all on the same page. It's critical that we're coordinated in our response and coordinated in what we to anticipate. They agreed with me that we had to make sure we gave Putin no excuse. Let me emphasize, we gave Putin no excuse to blame this on the West or to blame this on NATO. We made clear that we were not involved. We had nothing to do with it. This was part of a struggle within the Russian system. I also talked at length with President Zelensky of Ukraine. We'll be keeping in contact with him. I may be peeking later today, early tomorrow morning, to make sure we continue to remain on the same page. I told him that no matter what happened in Russia, let me say it again, no matter what happened in Russia, we, the United States, will continue to support Ukraine's defense and its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. He and I agreed to follow up and stay in constant contact. I'm also in constant contact with our allies to maintain our coordination. I'll be speaking with the head of state right after this meeting today and making sure we're on the same page. I didn't get a chance to speak with one head of state yesterday. We're going to keep assessing the fallout of this weekend's events and the implications for Russia and Ukraine. But it's still too early to reach a definitive conclusion about where this is going. The ultimate outcome of all this remains to be seen. But no matter what comes next, I will keep making sure that our allies and our partners are closely aligned in how we are reading and responding to the situation. It's important we stay completely coordinated. And now I'd like to turn to today's announcement. Begin by asking a question. Did you lay all that cable?
Director John Brennan, you and I were interrupted, but for a very good reason. The president was addressing the situation, saying that they had been monitoring it, coordinating importantly with the allies, making sure they were all on the same page, that they did not give Putin any excuse to blame this on the West, blame this on NATO, because it is an internal matter. And I can acknowledge to you that just pulling the curtain back, those of us who were making calls all day Saturday and Sunday, where it was very hard to pry any information, and none of it was on the record from any officials. It was all on what we would call deep background, not acknowledging even that a senior official had said this. They didn't want any American fingerprints on developments or in their assessments. So with that backdrop, which you know so well from the inside, how good was our intelligence going into this as Prigozhin was ramping up his criticism of Shoigu and Gerasimov and the military? How prepared were we for what happened?
Well, I think as we've seen in the public sphere, there was a fair amount of activity and rhetoric from Mr. Prigozhin that heralded, I think, his rather impulsive move over the weekend as he moved his forces toward Moscow. So I'm sure the intelligence community, CIA and others, were looking very carefully at the intelligence to see what he, in fact, might be planning. And I'm pleased to see that the reporting indicates that the intelligence was provided to President Biden, the administration, so they could anticipate some of these twists and turns of developments over the weekend. And I must say, I think the Biden administration has handled the situation very well, made it very clear that this situation is a matter of internal Russian dynamics. We have had nothing to do with it, and they're not going to do or say anything that is going to be perceived as trying to influence events there. And so as this continues to unfold, I think the Biden administration is going to continue to try to stay as closely aligned with our allies and partners around the globe, watch the situation very carefully, be very concerned that there could in fact be further internal turmoil in Russia that could be destabilizing, and this is particularly worrisome given that it has a strategic nuclear weapons arsenal.
The one thing they were willing to say on the record was that they were confident that the nuclear arsenal was secure, that command and control was being maintained, and they were maintaining communications. So what we don't have with the Chinese, military-to-military communications, in this whole crisis did continue, clearly, with Moscow, with the Kremlin. Let's talk about Prigozhin, because he released an audio message today on Telegram and was not indicating exactly where he is, but certainly again accused Russia, the Russian military, which means Shoigu and Gerasimov, of having attacked his troops, said that 30 of his men had died in the attacks that preceded his decision to take on the military.
Yeah, Prigozhin still has a fair amount of influence and standing, which is why I think Putin is trying to treat the situation very, very carefully. He recognizes that if he were to move against Prigozhin in Belarus or wherever Prigozhin is, it could in fact result in some very, very untoward developments to the Wagner Group. What he doesn't want to do is to alienate a force that has proved to be, I think, an effective battlefield force of tens of thousands of individuals, and not just in Ukraine, but also in other countries. I think he's trying to keep intact that force as he tries to assimilate and integrate it into the Ministry of Defense, which is going to be a tough call. And that's why Putin doesn't really have a strong hand now. I'm sure he is very, very frustrated with the likes of Defense Minister Shoigu and General Gerasimov because the war in Ukraine has gone so poorly. But he has to be very careful in terms of these next moves. I think his strategy is not to make the situation worse and to make sure that he's able to line up the support within the government, within the military, and even within the Wagner forces so that he doesn't take any precipitous move that is going to lead to further instability and could really seriously threaten his continued political and physical survival.
But knowing Vladimir Putin and the way he retaliates, no matter how long it takes, against those who oppose him, would you take out a life insurance policy on Prigozhin right now?
No, I certainly would not. But there is a saying that revenge sometimes is best tasted cold, and I do think he's going to wait and not do anything in a careless and reckless manner that could in fact lead to further instability. But I do think that Prigozhin has blotted his copybook, although in some respects, you know, he did it frontally. Putin has gone to great lengths to go after and try to assassinate, for example, Russian intelligence officers who have betrayed their country by working with Western intelligence services. Prigozhin made no secret of his displeasure with what was going on in Ukraine and the military's prosecution of that war. So maybe in some respects, Putin appreciates that it was done frontally and openly, but Prigozhin still presents, I think, a pretty serious challenge to Putin's rule and his control, and I don't think Putin is going to allow anyone, if he's able, to continue to present such a challenge.
And if put on your CIA hat for a moment, if you were advising the president, how would you assess Vladimir Putin going on national television, interrupting their TV, and really, for the first time in 23 years that he's been in power, conveying his vulnerability, his weakness, and that there was insubordination in the ranks?
I think it just underscores the weakness of Putin right now. And I'm sure the people around Putin are continuing to try to figure out exactly which way to go. But the fact that Putin would do this, I think it just reflected his inability to control the situation and to take firm and decisive action against Prigozhin. I think he felt as though he needed to do something along those lines. But I think the coming days and weeks in terms of what Putin says and does publicly, what Prigozhin doesn't say publicly, will give us a sense of where this is going to go. But again, the situation is highly dynamic. I think there could be a lot of new developments that have been taking place. And so I don't think the threat to Putin's rule is by any means over at this point.
John Brennan, thank you so much. Your experience is invaluable to us. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And we just heard President Biden say that he and President Zelensky...
They can try to crawfish this all they want and backing it up, making it sound like that it's not that big of a deal. But the bottom line is this: if it was to have ever reached that state with any other government, including our own, to the point that the military turned upon to its leaders, it would be looked upon as an act of treason, and it would be treated as if it was an act of treason towards a military tribunal court until they found out what was going on, especially due to the fact that this guy had already taken out some of the Russian military. He says that they was fired upon before they fired upon to the oncoming, but the bottom line is this: he done what he done in a very, very destructive manner, and because of it, it would go further than a court martial in just about any logical government. So these games that they're playing and how that they're playing them, it's actually breaking the rule book in what the seriousness of these federal military agencies do or how they do. And to me, it was an attempted coup from within, and even Putin himself said something to that degree. Unbelievable in how much this guy has talked about, not this guy, but the guy that was in charge of the revoke. Unbelievable in how much information that he spewed out just within the past few days about the presidential government of Russia. That the war was basically a big hoax, and that they really didn't have no reason of going in and doing what they done to the Ukrainians, in which I can validate that myself, pertaining to the information that's been spread abroad publicly. They could have worked this out without it turning into a bloodshed. Besides that, Putin and his army and that other private army will still be looked upon as a bunch of thugs because of the way that they have went in and killed men, women, and children. It had reached the level of them being nothing but terrorists. They have broken all of the Geneva rules and regulations, and that was the whole sole purpose of ever creating that particular law book to begin with. So they can try to back crawl this all they want towards making it look like that it ain't such of a big deal, but the whole thing is a big deal. You go to killing innocent men, women, and children for no reason, you're considered a terrorist.
Zelensky will be speaking again either later today or early tomorrow after Sunday's call that they had concerning the situation in Russia and the impact on the war in Ukraine, and importantly on the counteroffensive. They also talked about the upcoming NATO summit 2 weeks from now in Lithuania, which Zelensky said he will not be attending if he is still being blocked from early admission to NATO. On the battlefield, Ukraine's counteroffensive has been meeting stiff Russian resistance, in some place 3 layers deep, I'm told. But the Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine says that Ukraine has regained roughly 50 square miles of land so far as of today. So joining us now, President Zelensky's former advisor, Igor Novikov, and the former Deputy Commander of U.S. European Command, Lieutenant General Steph Twitty. Welcome to both. Igor, it's good to see you. I know that a lot has happened since we last spoke. President Zelensky says that Russia is in complete chaos after the rebellion. How does President Zelensky's inner circle view both the past few days and how they can try to take advantage of Russian instability, primarily in the military?
Well, from what I know, Andrea, first and foremost, the situation, as Director Brennan said, is highly dynamic. So the assessments are happening constantly. The situation was incredibly dangerous because any chaos in Russia with, the mining of these Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants, and given what's happened with the Kakhovka water dam, could have led to unpredictable circumstances. Now, there are certain benefits for the front line for us to try and kind of push harder against the Russian defensive lines. But once again, the situation is dynamic, so no major disruption to Russia's military efforts so far observed by us.
General Twitty, Prigozhin called out Putin's pretext for war, calling it deceit. Listen to how residents in Rostov-on-Don reacted to Prigozhin's arrival.
Очень серьезные проблемы, и их нужно решать. И даже вот люди, которые уже не могут терпеть этого, они просто приходит к таким кардинальным методам.
Ощущение страх, естественно. Страх, паника, потому что как бы непонятно, что будет и что ожидать. Вот и все.
На мой взгляд, если была допущена возможность ввода войск, причем не российской армии, а частной военной компании в город и захвата нескольких объектов, ну, где-то на...
And we also heard cheering in the streets and people taking selfies with Prigozhin and his troops. So what's the impact on morale among Russian forces? Clearly, they have the internet. Many of them were conscripted into service reluctantly.
Well, there's no doubt that Prigozhin is viewed as a rock star now. What really made him the rock star inside Russia was his win in Bakhmut. And he's really the only force, the Wagner Group's the only force that's had a tremendous amount of success there. And so he's going to be viewed as a rock star. Then to take the southern headquarters without a shot, that further makes him a rock star. And so as the Russian soldiers look at this, particularly as he accused them for firing on his troops and all the rhetoric that he's talked about with them not being capable to fight, I'm sure that there's a lot of animosity within the ranks. I'm sure there's a lot of distrust between Wagner and Russian soldiers. And so trying to integrate these forces as a result of this brokered deal, I think it is a recipe for disaster for the Russian military. As you already know, that there's a tremendous amount of distrust and disarray in the formation anyway.
And Prigozhin, General, today asked his troops how many wanted to be absorbed by Russian forces, and he says extremely few wanted that. What happens next to Prigozhin's mercenaries?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of loyalty to Prigozhin by his soldiers. And we have to remember that Putin used the Wagner Group as an instrument of power, not just in Ukraine, but around the world. They've been used in Africa, Central Africa, and Libya. They've been used in Syria. And so I don't see this force going away in its totality. It may morph to something else, but I don't see it going away. And I think Putin will continue to rely on this force. Maybe without Prigozhin in charge, maybe someone else will step up. But I think we're going to find here, if I'm a betting man, that this force will stay around in some form or fashion.
Igor, the NATO meeting is only 2 weeks away in Lithuania, and President Zelensky has indicated he will not attend. If NATO is still divided over Ukraine's entry into NATO, doesn't move forward on a faster track, the U.S. is one of those countries that believes that NATO entry of Ukraine could be provocative to Russia. What's the feeling in Ukraine about this, about not getting into NATO quickly?
Well, Andrea, I would probably split this into two separate issues. So NATO, joining NATO for Ukraine is vital for its future security guarantees. So I think, most of the country, all of the country is looking forward to the day when we join. Now, the imminent kind of ascension to NATO is questionable because of some political resistance from some of the NATO members. But I would say the expectation on the ground is to have an open date invitation. So basically, to get the confirmation that Ukraine will be a NATO member at some point, and that date is still open. With the Wagner mercenaries, by the way, if I may add to what my colleague has said, the most dangerous part at the moment, I don't think that force will be disbanded. There are rumors that it will be stationed in Belarus and that the bases are being built. Now, after Prigozhin's antics, he becomes a wild card that can be used by Kremlin to do its bidding and to give Kremlin plausible deniability in any scandalous moves, such as an attack on Kiev again, or even an attack on a NATO member. So I think that situation should be monitored incredibly closely.
That is such an important point, Igor. Thank you so much. Lieutenant General Steph Twitty, Igor Novikov, thanks to both of you. And did the man known as Putin's chef cook up more than his old boss could handle? A look at the man behind the weekend rebellion in Russia next. Richard Engel is up. This is Andrea Mitchell Reports, only on MSNBC.
This is our premium platinum coverage map, and this is consumer cellular's map.
These are people that are vicious. And this is one of the things that I brought out within a few hours or a few days after this first began, that the world is not dealing with a bunch of goat herders. They're dealing with a sophisticated group of people over there that has their objectives and what that they want to do and how that they want to go about doing it. Now, they can disguise it up any way that they want to disguise it up, but the bottom line is this: whenever you go to shelling schools and regular apartments and maternity wards and other activities that we know that they have been a part of, regardless of what face that you want to put on it of who actually pulled the trigger, the buck stops at the bottom line pertaining to the Russian government that's involved in all this illegitimately against the Ukrainians that are probably, I ain't saying this for sure, but are probably using the Ukrainians for a pawn to be able to go into this even on a deeper, much deeper, cynical level of basically trying to regroup or reestablish the property that used to belong to the old Yugoslavia. And don't think for a second that the people over there in that area ain't onto this, because they are. That's the reason why the UN is right now being hesitant towards not allowing for the Ukrainians to become a member of the United Nations, because it could actually be looked upon as being a provocative measure. At this point in time, because of what the Russian government has done pertaining to their military, I don't see that it matters. Whether or not it's looked upon as being provocative or not, because they have broken every rule known to man. That was one of Putin's big beefs, other than saying that their people had been cheated because of the agreements that was made in the falling of the Berlin Wall towards the latter part of Ronald Reagan's administration, is that the Russians was really leaning towards a violation in contract pertaining to NATO not having the say-so in coming in around Russia. That was one of their biggest beefs. But once more, it was a lie, because there was nothing in the contract that stated that they would not do that. That NATO would not do that. So that's a bunch of hogwash coming from the Russian government towards saying that that's one of the reasons why that they're acting the way that they're acting against the Ukrainians. There is no logical explanation in what that these people have done, other than wanting to invade another country to be able to cripple that country and genocide every human being on that land. Just like there's really no logical explanation if your sole purpose was to take over the property because of the factories and the lakes and the hospitals and everything else that they'd established in the past 30 plus years. Why would you want to go in there and blow it all up? That is a madman approach that does not make sense logically, theoretically, that if your sole intent was to go in and conform that group of people and take back over that piece of property, why would you want to go over and destroy the property? That just shows you how out of kilter that this whole thing is in what escalated into this bloodshed to begin with. It is really, really incredibly, it goes beyond sad to the point of being stupid. And why NATO, America, why China is buttering up with them, why they're trying to turn this into a major world movement, it almost makes me think that the whole thing is being plotted or planned or staged towards turning it into a third world war. I don't know. I know if that happens with the type of armory that we have today, with the drones and everything else, God only knows how much suffering that is going to be done. And it ain't just going to be done in one particular area. It's going to be done worldwide, just like prices of food going up, just like gas going up, just like everything else becoming unstable. This isn't just going to affect a few million people over in that region. If this thing was to unfold into a full-fledged combat war in today's modern technology, it would affect almost every human being on the planet. The only people that it wouldn't affect would be people in the Amazon forest, or the people way up in the hills of China, or in the hills of Cambodia somewhere, or over in Africa somewhere, that basically ain't hooked up to modern day living, and they're still living primitive to begin with. Other than that, it's going to affect everybody. I mean, you may as well get ready for that if it ever does escalate into that level.
Prigozhin, who in a new message, as we said, insisted he was not trying to overthrow the government, just going up against the military. Prigozhin was once known as Putin's chef, who built a fortune providing food.
Now they're trying to whitewash it or backpedal it towards saying, well, it was just a protest. Well, that was a heck of a protest, if you ask me.
To the entire Russian military. He was also indicted in absentia by Robert Mueller for his hacking operation trying to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. Joining me now, NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel, who has been reporting extensively on Prigozhin, including his forces in Syria and most recently in Africa, and Andrew Weissman, former senior member of the Mueller probe, which investigated Prigozhin's role in 2016. Richard, what is your read of what's happening in Russia? What are your Ukrainian sources saying? And what does this tell you about Prigozhin?
Well, it doesn't seem like it's over. You talked about that statement, the audio statement that he issued a short while ago. No mention of Putin at all. No apology, no talk about a deal. In fact, he was still bragging about the Wagner Group, how powerful they were, and he offered his version of events. He said that he was given an ultimatum, that Wagner was supposed to be disbanded and absorbed into the Ministry of Defense, that his men refused that order, then were attacked, and in response, that 30 of his fighters were killed, and that in response, they broke into two columns. One went to Rostov, handed over its weapons, were greeted like heroes, and the other marched toward Moscow, only stopped after they had delivered their message, and that their message was how weak the country had become under its current military leadership. And he said, had his men been in charge from the very beginning, it would have been a quick war in Ukraine. He said the distance that they marched from their positions in Ukraine to 200 kilometers away from Moscow was the distance that they would have needed to have marched to capture Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, on the early days or even the first day of the war. Those are fighting words. He's still saying that his force is the best, that the Russian military is trash. No mention of Putin at all, no mention of a deal. So this does not sound like someone who's apologetic or has gone into hiding in Belarus and whose days, at least he believes, are numbered. So I think we're still in the midst of a mafia-style power grab or a mafia-style turf war, and it is unclear how this is going to play out. But I did not expect such a strong statement from Prigozhin. I thought perhaps he's gone to Belarus, maybe he's in some sort of protective custody and would issue a forced apology. That was not what we heard from him.
And Richard, you reported last month so memorably how the Wagner Group was making $500 million with a B dollars a year by tapping African resources like gold and blood diamonds, of course, to the detriment of the poor people living there. Tell us more about that.
So why would Prigozhin be so bold that he could have an army and march them toward Moscow, and then even after being facing down Putin, to continue to brag about his exploits? One, because he has troops, he has loyal forces, a lot of them, 25,000 at least, according to his estimation, and that number jives with Western intelligence figures. And he has money. He has independent sources of income. So he has muscle and he has wealth. And a lot of that wealth comes from his private activities in Africa, particularly the Central African Republic. We went there to learn more about how Prigozhin managed to take over the country, and Prigozhin has taken over the country. Wagner forces patrolled the streets of the Central African Republic, the capital Bangui, openly. They drive around in pickup trucks with no license plates. They generally cover their faces in balaclavas. They guard the president. I went to go see the president walking right by the Wagner troops. They are open in their control of the country. They control diamond mines. They control gold mines. They have helicopters that go right to the mine sites and extract the resources, and they have a complicit government. In exchange, they prop up the government, which was facing collapse because of a rebellion. So that's the deal that they've worked out in Central Africa. We'll protect the dictator, but in exchange, we'll take as much resources as we can fly out of the country. And they don't just do it in the Central African Republic. It's a model they're spreading. And it has given him quite a degree of power and made him so powerful, it seems, that maybe Putin didn't realize the extent of his growth.
In other words, it's given him a lot of charisma in being influential. And I'm sure this guy knows that. And because of it, he was flexing his arm. And his might, whenever he rebelled and was heading directly towards the Kremlin, where the Russian president, where all his staff members live and dwell in.
You have such unique knowledge up close of his role around the world, including in Syria. And Andrew, you know so much about the notorious troll farm in Russia that pushed online disinformation in the U.S. during the 2016 U.S. election. And he's admitted to being its founder.
Absolutely. So to Richard's point, the Treasury Department has for years now designated the Wagner Group as a transnational criminal organization and repeatedly imposed different sanctions. In the beginning of 2018, as part of the Special Counsel Mueller investigation, Prigozhin and numerous other people and a few companies were all charged in connection with, as you mentioned, Andrew, the running of the Internet Research Agency, which is a fancy name for a troll farm that interfered with the 2016 election here in the United States, but also was responsible for interfering in numerous other elections to the advantage of the interests of Russia. In the United States, it's documented that included disparaging Hillary Clinton. It was supporting her opponents in the Democratic primary. It was supporting Donald Trump and also denigrating Donald Trump's adversaries. So very much a pro-Trump organization, and also served to sow discord in the United States and he is currently under indictment. So while Russia may be saying that they're ending their criminal investigation, although it remains to be seen whether that lasts, that is not the case here in the United States.
Richard Engel, Andrew Weissman, two men who know so much about this man. Thank you both. And with a weakened Vladimir Putin still in the Kremlin, the world waits and watches for what's going to happen next. The latest from world leaders ahead. Watching Andrea Mitchell reports.
This is all in the opposite of peace and utopia.
I'm a Supreme Allied Commander. Back to the mid 2004, 2006 kind of time period. And as a result of that, the Ukrainians understandably are quite frustrated that they don't, in their view, have a clear path to NATO. And the reason is some of the NATO members, I would say correctly assess that if you bring Ukraine in the middle of a hot war with Russia, by definition, you are putting NATO in a state of war with Russia the day Ukraine signs the accession papers. So I think the way this will play out is when we get through the current fight, and let's hope Ukraine has a definitive victory, but however it comes out, a Korean War-like armistice, for example, however it comes out, when hostilities stop, that would be the moment to bring Ukraine in. I'm confident ultimately Ukraine will get membership, but you can hear the frustration in their voices when you talk to them.
And you can also hear the frustration at what they believe to be the slow delivery of aid. It arrives, but they don't have the F-16s. This is now when they could use it. Putin could be more vulnerable now, given the dissension in his ranks, but he has air supremacy. And if he decides that he wants to hammer Ukraine to show his muscle, this is the time he can do it. And their defenses, I'm told, are in some places 3 levels deep. They're putting up quite a fight against the counteroffensive.
Right, 2 wars, a tale of 2 wars. One is the land war. Here the Ukrainians are making progress, slow, but I think fairly sure-footed. And the recent events are going to sap Russian morale. I think the Ukrainians are going to pick up a good head of steam as the tanks come rolling in. Hopefully we'll also add the long-range American cruise missiles, the ATACMS, to the mix. That land war is going in favor of the Ukrainians. But you're exactly right. On the other side of the wars, the air war is going in favor of the Russians. And Putin still has 1,000 combat aircraft that he hasn't fully committed to this fight. When he does that, it's going to require a significant response from the Ukrainians. Those F-16s can't get there soon enough. And you and I have been talking about F-16s. You can go back and roll those tapes 6, 8, 12 months now. It's time to get them in the fight.
And very briefly, are you as confident as the U.S. says it is that command and control over the nuclear arsenal is secure?
I am. The Russian armed forces is a series of ghettos and penthouses. The ghetto has been on display, the really poorly made land fight in Ukraine. But the penthouses where they put their money, that's the nuclear forces, the long-range bombers. That is well-resourced and ready to go. I'm confident that one is covered.
Thank you so much. Former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, of course, James Stavridis. And what did they know and when did they know it? The latest on when U.S. intelligence agencies were tracking Prigozhin's rebellion. That's next. When the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark Warner, joins us right here on Andrea Mitchell.
They're toiling with people's lives. And if I was over in the Ukraine right now, I would feel like that the world was using me in not going in full force against this type of aggression. I would literally feel like that the world was letting me down. They're a bunch of sitting ducks. And the Russians know it. The Russian government knows it. They're toiling with them. But look at what price that they're toiling with them on. Innocent men, women, and children, tearing the whole region apart. What, it was something like 12, 14, 15 million people that's been ripped apart, not counting the collateral damage of how much trouble that it's caused in all those other countries surrounding Ukraine and Russia.
That's woodsbasementsystems.com.
Joining me now is one of the top lawmakers in the Gang of Eight who were briefed on Prigozhin's plans, Democratic Center and Intelligence Committee Chairman Mark Warner. Senator, thank you so very much. I know you can't share anything you've been briefed on, but what's your understanding of what is happening in Russia in the last few days, with Prigozhin saying in the last hour he was not trying to overthrow the government, and then he turned around to avoid Russian bloodshed?
Well, first of all, Andrea, appreciate you recognizing that, unlike some folks in American politics, I do understand that if you receive classified information, it needs to stay secret. Otherwise, people's lives could be in jeopardy. But the truth is, what Prigozhin was saying, you know, if you followed this, it's been hiding in plain sight, literally for weeks, as he's condemned the Russian conduct in the war in Ukraine, condemned the leadership. The message he laid out Saturday morning as his forces were advancing, I hope the Russian people heard, where he basically said it was all a sham. Putin's pretenses for going into Ukraine, there was never any threat from the Ukrainians. I hope that message got out. I think it's remarkable, though, that with a relatively small number of troops, he was able to take over Rostov. Now, Rostov was the command center for the whole war in Russia. War in Ukraine. And the fact that he was then able to get within 120 miles of Moscow, even though Putin had gone on the air and called him virtually a traitor on Saturday morning. We have a lot of unanswered questions, but as your previous commentator said, you know, the volatility in terms of what the future of Putin and that regime is still, I think, up in the air. I do think we know this, that the Putin of 5 years ago, the Putin that was more engaged as opposed to the Putin of today, who is so isolated, who doesn't want to hear any bad news, I can't imagine the Wagner Group leader making as much progress if he tried this a number of years back.
Can you imagine Vladimir Putin going on national television accusing Prigozhin of being a traitor, literally, of a stab in the back, and projecting vulnerability, as he did on Saturday morning?
Well, saying that, and then 5 hours later, cutting a deal with this same Prigozhin. And again, remember, neither one of these guys are good guys. We all know how awful and evil in so many ways Putin has been. But Prigozhin, you know, he is head of this mercenary group who've done atrocities in Ukraine, in Syria, in countries in Africa. Remember, Prigozhin was the owner of the Internet Research Agency who interfered in our elections in 2016, and he is subject to American indictment. So this is a very bizarre circumstance, but the lead up in terms of Prigozhin's comments, this has been happening literally for weeks, in some cases months, calling out the leadership of the Russian war effort.
And do we have any idea where Prigozhin is?
Well, I understand literally as I was coming on air that he is, says he's in Minsk, and he actually is, and get this, it's just reports that he is in one of the only hotels in Minsk that doesn't have any windows. And I say that because, again, this has been in public reporting, that there have been a number of Russian individuals who have run afoul of Putin over the last year and a half, who have mysteriously fallen out of 5th, 6th, 7th floor windows. So if he is in Minsk in a hotel with no windows, that would show at least what his mindset is in terms of how his relationships are with Putin at this point.
That's remarkable. What does this say? What does this tell you about Lukashenko? He's been an ally, a vassal, if you will, subject to Putin. But is he striking out on his own? Could he be one of the few winners here?
Well, remember Lukashenko, when there were actual elections in Belarus, all of the outside observers said Lukashenko lost. So following in that kind of oligarch autocratic system, he stayed in power with support from Putin. So the fact that he somehow magically brokered this deal when the Wagner forces were literally about 120 miles outside of Moscow, and those who said, Prigozhin's comments this morning saying he didn't want to have any bloodshed. Well, I believe this doesn't come from intelligence. This comes from your network and others who showed images of explosions in Russia, showed images supposedly of Russian helicopters being shot down. This sounds like it was a giant mess that everybody's trying to reframe and rewrite the history of what was literally happening real time around and watched by the whole world literally within the last 48 hours.
Crawfish. Trying to crawfish it. Trying to make it look like something that it wasn't. That's the deceit and that's the propaganda tool that the Russians use. And I'm sure that more importantly, that's the propaganda tool that they want to use against their own citizens. That way, it'll reach the point that that won't nobody trust nobody and don't nobody know who's telling the truth and who's telling a lie. Just total chaos. And usually whenever this happens, according to the Bible, that God will allow for the wicked to take out the wicked. In other words, they'll basically self-engulf one another, because there's no honor among thieves. There's no honor among cruel, indifferent, bad people. And it's very obvious that one group is just as crazed with bloodthirst as the other group is. It just so happens the guy that was supposedly protest, if you want to call it a protest, it just so happens what he's doing is openly, and what Putin is doing is kind of discreet about it, because Putin ain't walking around with a machine gun and actually in the trenches. He's still walking around wearing a nice casual suit. It's propaganda. And I guarantee you, that guy that done that, what was his name? I forgot his name now. That created the attempted insurrection against the government of Russia. He's got now basically a hit list on him now, to the point that he won't never be able to have no freedom whatsoever as long as he's within that region. I don't know for sure that he would even have any freedom of going somewhere else. He darn sure wouldn't have none coming over here, because if he did, he'd be arrested for war crimes. I don't know nowhere that guy couldn't go where he wouldn't be. Maybe Felice in Mexico would take him. I don't know. But I don't even know that they would risk having somebody like that over there. He is a marked man. And by him double-stepping the way that he did, now he is sure enough a traitor. Because he's going to be looked upon as being a liability and not an asset. And I guarantee you, the way them oligarchs play over there, it's just a matter of time before he will mysteriously, tragically disappear. It's a wicked, wicked game, all at the expense of innocent men, women, and children. And for the United States or the United Nations or some of those other bigger countries to sit back and idly watch this unfold the way that it has, I perceive as it would be the same thing if you was to sit in your front window and watch a murder or a rape or a robbery take place, and even though you may be scared towards not wanting to be identified or not wanting to go out there and actually stop it, but if you wasn't even willing to pick up the telephone to call the authorities so that they can intervene in the law being broken, now you're just as guilty in being an accessory to the fact, because you could have stopped it. these superpowers could have stopped this before it ever resonated to this level. And if they was going to do it, they should have done it within the first 30 days. They didn't stop it. They minimized it. They prolonged it. They did not stop it. They went ahead and let the Russian government have their way. And because of that, I personally believe that it makes now all the other major players that could have stopped it just as guilty as the perpetrators that's committing the act. That's the way I see it. There's no other way that I'm going to be able to justify in what that they have done. And the fact of the matter is, if anybody deserves an invasion, it is the Kremlin. It is Russia. Because of what that they have done to innocent lives. Plus going to war with a country that was undeserving. Undeserving. So you begin to start asking yourself a question, or I do. Where's the logic in all this? Where's the practicality in all this? I mean, we claim to be good, outstanding, moral, sophisticated citizens of society. Domesticated people. We claim to be civilized, domesticated Homo sapiens. But yet now, these major players that could have intervened, that could have stopped it from ever escalating to the level that it is right now, did not do so. I would be absolutely 100% heartbroken if I was the Ukrainians right now, regardless whether it was the leader or those working under the leader, of feeling like that I was being used. I was being played as a pawn towards this escalating into something even bigger. Something even beyond just Ukraine. Basically a group of people that is sitting back and waiting for the main show to begin. Kind of like what happened in the insurrection January the 6th in America. Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump and several other people below them, regardless whether they was Democrat or Republican, they knew, including the Secret Service, knew the high profiling that was going on in reading the tea leaves, as they call it, in knowing what people was thinking and how that they was feeling. They knew that the odds of something major occurring on that day was greater than it was lesser. And because of it, that's the reason why people such as myself see it as being some sort of a stage that a group of people that knowed better went ahead and allowed for their defense to be lowered so that it would turn into what it turned into. In other words, they was welcoming that. And they may not have been doing that consciously, but subconsciously, I truly believe that there was a lot of people that had a itchy good feeling, a gut feeling per se, that something was going to happen, especially whenever you had people announcing that something big was on its way. January the 6th, come and watch the big show. Whenever you have people that's actually advertising that, and then the people that's supposed to be in charge of safety didn't bring in extra protection pertaining to the National Guard, yeah, there was no way that the Capitol Police could have could have defended themselves with that big of a mob, with that many people attacking them at one time. That's the reason why I say, and I'm just not speaking for myself, I'm speaking for other people that have said the same thing, that it looked like that it was staged. Regardless whether it was staged by the Republicans or staged by the Democrats, it looked like it was staged because too many factors come in line towards deliberate negligence. Regardless whether it was Trump, regardless whether it was Nancy Pelosi, regardless whether it was other bodies of authoritarian body that could have made the call towards bringing in extra forces, that never was called. They deliberately set themselves up for it to turn into what it turned into. And I'm not the only one that sees it that way. And I guarantee you I'm not going to be the only one that sees the Ukrainian war towards either America, the United Nations, India, China, and not intervening towards stopping it from ever escalating it to the level that it is right now. And God only knows what kind of level that it's going to wind up 6 months from now or a year from now. And I tend to wonder, subconsciously speaking, that that's what they're wanting. Now they'll tell you, oh no, we're for peace, we're for peace. We're for love, we're for utopia, we're for peace. It's one thing to say it, and it's another thing to implement it. It's just like the people over here in America that did not want to support the windmill ministries, knowing that the windmill ministries supported peace, supported love, supported grace, supported the things out of the Bible. Yes, we do also support the ramifications of the end time events coming out of the book of Revelations and Daniel, but by and large, the message coming from the windmill ministries has been the message of the Lord Jesus Christ and God's divine grace. The same message that's supposed to be coming from all the other authentic churches here in America. So why the windmill ministries missions has not obtained some sort of a Joel Osteen congregation or a support team, proof is in the pudding, especially after 30 some odd years hitting the beat, going out into the field, putting out your information, and still to this day don't have supporters? Don't have supporters? Proof is in the pudding. They only want to talk about a generic peace. They only want to talk about a aftermarket peace. The people in America has gotten so used to taking on seconds. You know, at one time, we used to be number one. We ate good. We was clothed good. We had good roads. We had good bridges. We had good lakes. We had good hospitals. We was number one in agriculture. We was number one in the medical industry. We was number one. But America has taken a second seat in now being satisfied in being number two. Taking basically the scraps that falls from the master's table. And I got news for you. According to the way that I read the Bible, God's people are not supposed to be taking the scraps that falls from the master's table. Once more, if you're not sitting at the table, odds are you're probably on the menu. And until the American people wake up to this type of hypocrisy, and that's exactly what it is, it's hypocrisy. Now, we call it coming from Russia, we call it nothing but a premier lie, because theirs isn't quite as disguised as ours is. We call it propaganda. But it doesn't matter if it's disguised propaganda. It doesn't matter if it's open propaganda. It doesn't matter if it's manipulating propaganda. Propaganda is propaganda. A lie is still a lie, and the truth is still a truth. And whenever you compare apples to oranges, proof is still in the pudding towards a bunch of people that says one thing that turns around and usually does just the opposite. Now, let's look at something else from another perspective real quick. Does the American people want an all-out and out nuclear war? I don't think so. I don't think the people in America wants that. I don't think the people in Russia wants that. I don't think the people in Ukraine wants that. I don't think the people in China wants that. I don't think nobody truly wants to see an all-out and out nuclear war. But that's the area that we're diving off into every day as we compromise the truth, manipulate our motives. Eventually, somebody will grow enough you-know-what between their legs to the point that something actually does occur. And it may not be over in Ukraine or Russia that it occurs. It may be over in the Middle East. It may be with Iran. It may be with North Korea. It may be with some other country that's unexpected, or it may be a group of people that basically stole or invented or created a nuclear bomb or bought a nuclear bomb. I mean, there's too many cooks in the kitchen. And to say that things are stable right now is only a hallucination. It's an hallucination by saying that things are stable. Now, which leads me to the final thing that I want to say here. Hypothetically speaking, let's say that there was a nuclear war. Let's say that it was an all-out and out dismantlement of a nuclear war. And now you got people that's dying by the thousands, by the millions. Not just of the initial blow, but also in the aftermath. The people that will be guilty of allowing for this to happen, odds are, will probably have already made arrangements to the point that they'll go live in a cave somewhere for the next 7, 8, 10 years until the radiation level lowers to the point that they can come back out into the open. In the meantime, the suffering and the pain goes on. In the meantime, the people that are truly guilty of either creating that or allowing for that to get to that level are basically scot-free. So it is not justice dominating injustice, but it's rather the other way around. It's injustice that is dominating justice. Which leads me to my final thought pertaining to Star Trek, of them coming back to planet Earth, and I know it was just a show. But it was a show that was so devastating whenever I was at the age of 12 or 13 or 10 or whatever age that I was whenever I watched it. It literally made me tear up. That they come back and the planet Earth was gone, in a sense, towards it being nuked. And there was very, very few survivors. They detected life in a particular area and they beamed down to that life. And there towards the last, they come across the American Constitution, because it was two tribal groups at the time that was suffering, that was fighting for dominance. And that's where Captain Kirk intervened in the movie in discussing to them that liberty was supposed to be for all and not just part of all. And that goes with today in talking about the liberation of the people in Ukraine. Because it's not just the people in Ukraine that are being victimized by all this. It's everybody else, such as myself, that watches this, that realizes how unfair that the propaganda The manipulation is in understanding that there's certain people that could actually stop this, but are not stopping this. So it makes me wonder, because you're not stopping this, are you wanting it to escalate into an actual third world war or a nuclear war? Once more, when everybody is dying, throwing up on one another because of nuclear radiation, all our food is contaminated, we're sitting and watching our children dying of a slow, miserable death, or we're watching our parents dying of a slow, miserable death, who are we going to blame other than ourselves? You talk about a travesty. At that point in time, there will be no
permitting an armed force to exist.
There will be no crawfishing. There will be no backing up. The damage had been done. In the meantime, you got all these oligarchs and all these rich people that are already making their plans towards living in these caves until they can basically rejuvenate the planet Earth again. You know, that's the whole primary purpose of them taking spaceships out into other parts of the world, is to create a genesis.
Off in Belarus at this point, that all of these Wagner forces, who have borne the brunt many times of some of the most bloody fighting in Ukraine, are suddenly going to, simply turn around and salute a set of at least military leaders that have demonstrated pretty much ineptness on the field.
Senator Mark Warner, Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, thank you so much on all of this breaking news. We appreciate it. And so you just heard that we believe that Prigozhin is in Minsk in Belarus. And that does it for this edition of Andrea Mitchell Reports. Chris Jansing Reports starts right now.
That's the whole purpose for them going beyond the perimeters of Earth, is because they know that they have contaminated Earth. And because of it, they're not actually looking for life. There is life beyond our life out in outer space. But it is a supernatural spiritual life, kind of like an angel or a demon. It's a live energy entity that will actually survive more so than even our own personal lives.
Moscow over the weekend.
Because they don't never die, in a sense, towards the way that we die in our bodies. So it's not that they're actually looking for life, is that they're looking for an area to sustain life. That way, once the earth becomes so contaminated and it does all blow up, maybe they can create a genesis towards starting all over again.
Actually are still unknown, since we don't know exactly when or where.
Which once more is against God's will. God's will was not that humanity created a genesis somewhere else to start all over again. That's not in the Bible. Now there will be a new start, but it will be a new start in the spiritual realm and not in the fleshly realm. That's the reason why the Bible says that God will wipe away all their tears, and there'll be a new heaven and a new earth.
The news poll says about former President Donald Trump.
There will be a spiritual genesis. But as far as I know, according to the way that I've read the Bible, it's not in line towards another physical, fleshly genesis. That is only being engineered by certain humans on this planet. And I hope that you can relate to that and understand that. The end is the end. The beginning was the beginning, and the end is the end. That's the reason why the Bible says that He is Alpha and Omega. I am who I am. God has always been God. That's the part that a lot of your atheists and your antichrist type people don't want to accept. They want to put accountability off on the Creator. The Creator is the one that created everything. He is the boss. He is God. He is worthy of all our praise and our honor. And if you're not willing to do that, then that makes you defiant. And that's the reason why that Lucifer is going to get the punishment that Lucifer deserves, and those that followed after Lucifer, is because they was defiant. They went up against the Almighty. They went up against the heavenly kingdom. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Prigozhin is alive, and possibly he is alive, and possibly he is in Belarus. They have still a bit of a crisis in dealing with the Wagner group, because these are hardened soldiers who were very loyal to Prigozhin, especially those who were fighting with him in Ukraine. It's hard to imagine that they would turn around and just let themselves be commanded by regular Russian military commanders, whom by all accounts they don't really have much respect for. And then there's the global Wagner operation, mostly located.
Too many cooks in the kitchen. Too many cooks in the kitchen. Right is right, wrong is wrong. You're either part of the solution to the problem or you're part of the problem. No gray areas. Just like Jesus said, for he that is not with me is against me.
Located in Africa and in the Middle East, and that's also been overseen by Prigozhin. And so I think that for now the Russian government may need him.
Do you agree with that, General? And I want to give the exact quote. Andrea just spoke with Senator Warner, and what he said was, this is just reports. He is in one of the only hotels in Minsk without windows.
Well, Chris, thanks. And of course, I often align myself with Evelyn's analysis, as I've done for years. I think it's worth keeping in mind that what we have seen the last 72 hours is not the kind of thing that occurs in an army that believes it is on a path to victory. So it exposes not only the fragility of Putin's control, but also what's going on inside the military. If the report of Shoigu being still on the job as defense minister is accurate, then that clearly demonstrates that Putin values loyalty over competence, because in any other place, a guy like Shoigu, with all the failures and the corruption, the fact that he could not even stop a 400 vehicle convoy that was driving through Russia 2 days ago, that level of incompetence is a good thing for Ukraine. Prigozhin, I saw the tweet that Senator Warner was referencing, but you don't know if that's somebody being sarcastic, as often happens on social media. But Lukashenko seems to me to be the big winner in this whole thing. I mean, he came out of nowhere, and now he just got a guy who is a big giant personality, who could probably bring with him several thousand soldiers the way Evelyn described them. And Lukashenko probably has economic interests in Africa of his own, and this makes him a little bit more secure against a Russian grab of Belarus, if this is accurate.
Yeah, all of which.
And who's to say that any of it's accurate? Because they're so full of propaganda over there. They're probably sniggering and laughing right now whenever somebody watches a show like this, towards thinking, yeah, they've taken the bait again. They're talking about this stuff just like it really is happening. Who's to say that we're not being played? I think that we are. But how come as many good strategists as we have over here, how come we ain't been able to see through the smoke screen and just exactly what's going on and why it's going on, in behind who's doing it? There's a bigger player in all this. And that player is a supernatural being called the Antichrist. I promise you. Putin can stand up there and he can talk about the Lord and the Bible all he wants all day long. But what he's been involved in is not of God. It's not even close to being of God. What he's doing is basically being an imitation of Satan himself, creating all this havoc and hurt and horror and sorrow in innocent people's lives. The man needs to be taken out. He has turned into a wild animal. He's the same thing as it would be if we had a polar bear in Yellowstone National Park that had done already killed 2 or 3 people. Are we going to let that polar bear go? We're going to let that polar bear go around and continue to kill more people that come out of Canada, out of the North Pole somewhere? Are we going to take the initiative towards taking the beast out. I've never seen so much hypocrisy in my entire life.
Again, big asterisk on every single thing that we don't know. But it certainly does put to rest the idea that there was some sort of deal, any chaos is over, and it's back to business as usual.
Yeah, I mean, that's right, Chris. We have a lot of moving parts, things that we should question, things that we should watch. One part of it is Prigozhin.
People like the Saudi Arabians are watching this, and they're sitting back and they're laughing and they're having their parties and they're just hee-hawing up and down, just like that they was laughing and hee-hawing of the destruction of almost 3,000 people in one day. You gotta go, if you're gonna kill the snake, you gotta cut the head of the snake off to ever be able to kill the snake. You can't take out the tail and little bitty pieces of the snake and still think that you're safe. You're not safe until you cut the head of the snake off. When you cut the head of the snake off, then is whenever you have security. Then is whenever you are safe. Until then,
Now, I think for
none
the
of us is
the
safe.
United States and our allies and partners is Ukraine. You know, what is going to be the impact right now on Ukraine? Because there's a war going on there, and Prigozhin is not going to save us from the reality there in Ukraine. The fact that we have to continue helping Ukraine with all of our equipment, with better equipment, with training, with intelligence, and we can't take our eye off that ball. Yes, there's a crisis in Russia, and Putin is significantly weakened. But I don't foresee any, sudden change in who's ruling Russia. However, I will say that if Putin doesn't clamp down soon, there may be elites around him that might try to maneuver to take advantage of the situation. So a lot of moving parts. I think for us, we mainly need to watch Ukraine. We know our government is watching inside Russia and watching the sensitive military sites, the nuclear sites. And for the rest of it, we'll just have to see what we can find out over time.
From a military standpoint, General, what will you be watching for within Ukraine? I think a general analysis has been that a counteroffensive has not exactly, run over Russia. Having said that, is there an opportunity here that did not exist 72 hours ago?
Well, first of all, let's keep in mind for Ukraine's counteroffensive, it has started, but the main attack has not started. So, I mean, about 20% of their forces have been committed so far, and I think they are still looking for opportunity, looking for vulnerabilities and creating opportunities that they'll exploit with the several brigades that they have that are waiting. So I'm extremely bullish on Ukraine's counteroffensive and the main attack when it does get started. Now, for the Russians, first of all, they're going to have to replace 25,000 troops. I mean, if that number of Wagner troops is accurate, those guys are off the table. They will not be very keen on getting integrated into the army as privates after having been paid mercenaries in better conditions. They'll have no interest in doing that. And the army hates mercenaries as much as they hate the Chechens and the FSB intelligence service. So that's a big gap that the Russian Ministry of Defense will have to fill, those 25,000 troops. And then finally, if I'm a Russian soldier sitting in one of these trenches and I'm aware or growing aware of what's happening above me and behind me, you start thinking, man, I don't want to get killed here in what looks like a losing effort, or it may it might be about to collapse. No soldier wants to get killed or hurt in that kind of an environment. So I think we'll see an impact on their morale. Ukrainian defense minister has already started communicating directly to Russian soldiers saying, you do not have to die here. Your enemy is back in Moscow, not in Ukraine.
One of the things, Evelyn, that Prigozhin said in his statement was that he asked his troops, do you want to integrate essentially into the Russian forces? And he said only 1 to 2% said that they would want to do that. He is a master of disinformation, but given what you just heard from the general and what you know about the situation on the ground, could that ring true to you, or at least something like it?
It rings true to me, Chris, because the one thing that distinguished Prigozhin, because aside from his real bloodthirstiness and his brutality, although we did see that also in other elements of the Russian military. But the one thing that distinguished him was how outspoken he was on behalf of his troops in the field, right? No other Russian commander was publicly advocating like that. And probably privately, also not advocating for the regular conscripts, because it's not really part of the Russian military culture to care about the conscripts. They have a horrible history of, frankly, hazing the conscripts. So I think that if the Prigozhin warriors, they're not interested in fighting for some general that they think is more interested in pleasing the higher command than in looking out for them.
General, we're out of time, but I want to ask you really quickly, what do you think the chances are that Prigozhin survives this?
I think if it's true that he is with Lukashenko, he has a better chance of surviving, but he'll have to sleep with one eye open for the rest of his life.
Evelyn Farkas, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, please stay with me because ahead for us, capitalizing on chaos. Ukraine gets a morale boost from that Russian rebellion, but will it translate to the battlefield? We're back in 60 seconds.
Our true adversary is sitting back right now, laughing and hee-hawing, thinking to himself, well, there's really no need for us to go after certain groups of people because now we have asphyxiated so much doubt and being paranoid of one another and not trusting one another that now they're just going to take out each other, and once they're through taking out each other, then we can go and pick up the pieces. I've said this again and again and again about our adversary that is out to kill, steal, and destroy, and people obviously are not listening to me.
So we're now hearing interesting new reaction to the revolt in Russia coming from none other than Ukrainian troops who greeted the news, we're told, with applause. One commander in the field saying, quote, any chaos and disorder on the enemy's side benefits us. But there's also new reporting that Ukraine's counteroffensive is facing its own fresh set of threats from Russian landmines. NBC News foreign correspondent Raf Sanchez is in Kyiv with the latest. I'm also joined again by retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe and senior advisor now at Human Rights First. So, Raf, Prigozhin's Wagner Group is credited with some of the most ruthless Russian offensive in the war so far, including well known in the key city of Bakhmut. But do we know yet where those troops have gone? Are they in play? Is there any immediate impact on the ground? All those questions.
So, Chris, most of those Wagner mercenaries from the area around Bakhmut had withdrawn already. Big picture, across the whole southern and eastern frontier where the counteroffensive is raging, we have not yet seen any major breakthrough. We have yet to see the Ukrainians find a way to capitalize in a big way on the chaos on the Russian side. But you can absolutely bet that officials here in Kyiv very closely monitoring what's happening inside Russia, looking for any weaknesses that they may be able to exploit. The Ukrainians did announce this morning that they have liberated another village in the southeast. This is the 9th village since the start of the counteroffensive. But Chris, they were hoping to be talking about liberating cities rather than villages. And as you said, this is very difficult fighting. That said, we did speak to a Ukrainian officer today, and he says, look, even if this Wagner rebellion is over for now, even if the Russians aren't going into an all-out shooting match with each other, he is absolutely convinced that the events of the last 48 hours have damaged Russian morale and that they will have an impact on Russia's ability to fight on the front line, especially with many of these conscripts who are sitting there wondering, as their leaders squabble amongst themselves, what exactly it is that they are doing in southern and eastern Ukraine.
So if you're on the Ukrainian side, General, how does this change your strategic approach to this war at this moment? Or does it?
Well, the things that are going to make their counteroffensive successful will be the destruction of the Russian headquarters and Russian logistics. So everything that we can do to help them accomplish that with long-range precision weapons is going to reduce the damaging effect of the minefields that they're having to clear, because when they're at the minefield, they're getting hit by Russian artillery. So we've got to help them do that. And then, of course, the information effort on the Ukrainian side targeting Ukrainian or Russian soldiers to say, look, you don't have to die here. Your leaders do not care about you. This thing is not going to last forever. Now's your chance. And so I think they're going to work hard to influence how Ukrainian troops and leaders are thinking about things. But in the meanwhile, they're going to continue to go after headquarters and artillery and minimize or neutralize the only advantage that the Russians really have.
Ralph, the New York Times reported that this information that we were just talking about, that one of the biggest hurdles for Ukraine's military is an incredible web of Russian-laid landmines. Quote, one senior U.S. military official said the fierce resistance has taken a toll on Ukraine's weaponry. The United States committed 113 Bradley fighting vehicles in March, at least 17 of them. More than 15% have been damaged or destroyed in the fighting so far. Are Ukrainian troops in a position to take all of this in stride? What is the concern that you might be hearing about this? Give us an update from the perspective there on the ground.
So Ukrainian officials from President Zelensky on down have acknowledged progress has been slower than they hoped and that this is very, very difficult fighting. Just in terms of the Bradley vehicles, many of them were lost literally in the opening hours of this counteroffensive, Chris. There is a lot of video that we have analyzed that shows some of these Bradley vehicles. They are designed to carry infantry quickly over the battlefield. They run into a minefield and then they come under very intense Russian fire. And one of the other major problems, Chris, is that the Ukrainians are very badly outgunned in the skies. They have this kind of aging fleet of Soviet-era aircraft, helicopter gunships. The Russians have many more and much more advanced air power. And at this point, there really isn't very much the Ukrainians can do to match them in the skies. They say that's why it's so important that they get their hands on.
And that's the reason why that I say that they're being played, they're being used, because those airplanes, that type of artillery, should have already been over there. The Ukrainians are being played. I don't know if they're being played intentionally or not intentionally, but people does not have their backs that was committed to them way before Donald Trump ever become president.
Day with a Ukrainian unit preparing to deploy to the front line in the east, and they were training on American-made MRAPs. These are these heavily armored vehicles used by the U.S. Army in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. They are designed to withstand major explosions from mines, from IEDs planted on the sides of roads. The Ukrainians seem to be having a bit more success in the last couple of days of the counteroffensive, bringing these MRAPs into play. But the British Ministry of Defense said over the weekend that the Ukrainians have basically paused and reset this counteroffensive, trying to take into account the painful lessons that they learned in the first few days and figure out how they can put them to better use on the battlefield. Chris?
Is it time, General, in understanding that even once commitments are made, it takes time for, let's say, if you commit a certain amount of weaponry, for it to get to where it's needed? But is it time, and would you assume that what's happening is that there is already a reassessment by the U.S. and its allies, that there may be some things that they can do if indeed they see an opening here, an opportunity that didn't exist 3 or 4 days ago?
So if you mean an opportunity to give Ukraine additional...
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to say, despite all the good things that
it should be
has done, I am still bewildered why they don't say we want Ukraine to win and push to Ukraine the specific capabilities that would make such a big difference. Of course, I'm talking about F-16s,
right?
ATACMS, the 300-kilometer range weapon, the Gray Eagle drones,
heat them up,
ground-launched small diameter bombs. Why the administration continues to hold off on doing this, I don't understand it.
Neither do we. Neither do we.
It would enable them to hit headquarters and artillery and logistics much more effectively. But if I may, so that the quote from some defense official about how many Bradleys were damaged or lost, first of all, in the great scheme of things, that is a very, very small number. I don't know how many of them were recovered and can be repaired. I would assume several of them could be repaired and put back into the fight. More importantly, the soldiers that are in these vehicles, I've been reading reports, as you have, that a lot of soldiers survived because of the equipment that they are in. And so the troops getting back into the fight, equipment being recovered and sent back into the fight. And as you pointed out, as Ralph pointed out, the Ukrainians are very good at learning and adapting. And so I have great optimism about what lies ahead for this offensive.
Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, Raf Sanchez, thank you both so much. Up next, new NBC News polling on how Trump's federal indictment is affecting his run for the White House, plus Joe Biden's diplomatic dilemma, what the president and the administration is saying and isn't saying about the armed rebellion in Russia. You're watching.
So sad. It is really, really so much.
Does not have a say.
So much topsy-turvy. So much topsy-turviness going on right now. Just like the Bible says, that God will allow for the wicked to take out the wicked. But I'm telling you, the real wicked people that are masterminding this, supernaturally speaking, from the spirit world, are sitting back and they're waiting for this to occur. That way, once they become so weak, they'll just come in and take over the pieces, providing that that's what they want to do. If there's not enough of that region left after they get through scorching it, may not be nobody even wants to go over there and deal with taking or picking up the pieces. That guy right there, he is a marked man. And at this point in time, I don't know where he could go, including Mexico or South America. I don't know where that he could go and have safe haven. Maybe the Amazons. He could probably go to the Amazons and hook up with one of the tribal groups over there, providing that they would allow for him to. I'm just hypothetically speaking at this point in time, that he knew that whenever he turned against that authoritarian, he knew what the consequences of that's going to be.
Say in what's happening. I think what he also wants to try and do is put this in the broader context of national unity, which is something that he attempted to do in that speech that he made on Saturday before he struck this deal with Prigozhin. So even if Prigozhin is still going to be a factor in Russian politics, I think probably he will be as long as he's alive. Then I think that Putin is going to try and minimize his importance to the best of his ability.
Alex Bordeaux, it's been great having you on the program. Thanks so much. We do appreciate your time. Meantime, across the country, thousands of travelers are facing flight delays after powerful storms ripped through parts of the country. According to FlightAware, nearly 4,500 U.S. flights have already been delayed just today, particularly in the southeast and the Ohio Valley. That includes the state of Indiana, where 2 suspected tornadoes touched down. At least 1 person was killed. Major damage was caused in parts of that state. And that's not the only severe weather we're tracking. Extreme heat also blamed for the death of a 14-year-old boy who was hiking in Big Bend National Park in Texas. Temperatures were around 108 degrees at the time. The boy's stepfather tried to get help for him, but was also killed when the car he was in crashed down an embankment. That's going to do it for us this hour. Make sure to join us for Chris Chancing Reports every weekday, 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern, right here on MSNBC. Our coverage continues with Katie Tur reports after a short break.
One way to avoid expensive car repair bills.
You just don't have a car. Ride a horse. Then you have high horse bills. Hay's gone out of sight.
Constant Contact, helping the...
Until the right people wisen up towards who is behind all of this, masterminding all this, they're going to be just like a dog chasing after its tail. They're going to be going around and around in circles. They're going to be moving, but they're not going to be going nowhere. I can read through this smoke screen, It's all leading to something even greater, even bigger. That's going to inevitably cost all of us. And if it don't cost us in one form, it'll cost us in another. I mean, you got to look at World War II, how badly that it affected the Americans over here. That affected probably, I'm going to say, 8 out of 10 Americans over here during World War II of the seriousness of all that. And the only people that it wasn't affecting was those that was either too old not to realize that they was being affected, or those that was too young that couldn't understand what was going on. The rest of the people was being affected. They was being affected one way or the other during World War II. And if we don't watch, that's exactly where this is going to lead to, which is the very opposite of peace and utopia, the very thing that the founder of the Windmill Ministries Missions has been promoting now for 30 plus years. Proof is in the pudding. The Americans never did want peace. They wanted a generic aftermarket peace. They didn't want a true, holy, anointing, godly, revival peace.
Across the continent to show you how new connections are even.
Another viewer chiming in, wealth to me is knowledge that I am free in my relationship with the God of the universe. Quoting Paul, I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. That's a beautiful one. I really, really love that.
You got to be diversified if you're a Christian. You got to be willing to be content. It don't matter if you're in a church, singing in a choir, or if you're in a jail cell. You got to learn to diversify.
Toward the end of the survey, they had
We are getting word, according to Russian state media, that Vladimir Putin is about to make a statement, and we are working to confirm that. We will certainly cover that for you in whatever form it comes in. Stay with us here because we do understand we're about to hear something from Vladimir Putin after a historic weekend in Russia. And it's interesting to recall what Winston Churchill said about Russia back during World War II. He called the country a riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. And that is ever true at this moment. President Biden came out a short time ago to deny that there was any U.S. involvement in the attempted coup over the weekend.
We gave Putin no excuse to blame this on the West or to blame this on NATO. We made clear that we were not involved. We had nothing to do with it. This was part of a struggle within the Russian system.
Now, whatever will happen next, we do know
it's internal. We understand that. It's internal.
Reporting and the news from Russian TV that Vladimir Putin will speak tonight. Joining me now from Moscow is NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simmons. So Keir, this news that he's going to speak, it's 10 o'clock there. When do we expect this to happen?
We don't know, Katie, and we don't know what he's going to say. Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, saying that he will make a series of important announcements. We could speculate on what it may be, but it's incredibly hard to predict the turn of events at the moment here in Moscow. I do think that President Putin will have felt that he needed to say something. The Kremlin releasing a video of him giving a speech to young Russian engineers today that did not in any way address the rebellion that rocked Russia over the weekend, may even have been recorded before the weekend. So that kind of silence, if you like, from Russia's president couldn't go on much longer, especially after that dramatic 11-minute piece of audio from Evgeny Prigozhin, the leader of that militia group, the Wagner group, who led that rebellion through the weekend, in which, despite the fact that he had allegedly been kind of sent off to Belarus, he said that he was not going to disband his militia, continued his criticism of the so-called special military operation in Ukraine, even suggested that his march on Moscow here, they didn't reach Moscow before they turned around, that had exposed holes in Russian security that was a benefit to President Putin effectively. So really utter defiance from Prigozhin, and now I think we wait to hear whether or not President Putin has an answer.
Is it any different in Moscow today? Anything changed from the last time you visited?
Well, honestly, the answer, I guess, is probably not really. That is one of the kind of surreal aspects, is that, things seem fairly normal here. We have had an opportunity to go out and talk to ordinary Russians. I will say, to me, they seem bewildered. I said to one woman, what happens now? She just kind of shrugged and said, I don't know. Another Russian said to me, look, people should remember that Russians are dying too. Another said, listen, I don't want what's happening now, what we're seeing now, without really going into explanation for what exactly he meant. Did he mean the potential for Russians fighting Russians? Did he mean the special military operation in Ukraine, which has gone on for far longer than they were told by President Putin it would? It's dangerous, difficult to talk if you are Russian, obviously, especially to foreign media. But it is palpable that there's a kind of bewilderment about where this goes from here, and that's understandable, because I really don't think that Russia knows at this point.
Do we know where Vladimir Putin is? Did Russian state TV say where he will give this address? Do we know where Prigozhin is? Are we sure that he's in Belarus?
Good questions. I don't know where President Putin is, but he has a number of residences across Russia, some of them with offices that look exactly the same. So even if he gives a speech, we may not know where he is speaking from. In terms of Prigozhin, the reporting is that he is in Belarus, and actually another aspect, we're going to see some fast developments through the evening here. Another aspect, the president of Belarus, who kind of did this deal over the weekend, President Lukashenko, he is saying that he will have some things to say tonight too. So maybe we'll get more information. But I think another question beyond Prigozhin is, where are those thousands of Wagner fighters? Where are they? Because in that same statement, that defiant statement, he effectively said, well, I'm not going to disband my militia. I'm just not going to do that, despite the fact that over the weekend it was suggested that was the deal, that they would sign up to join the mainstream Russian military, if you like. He said, well, they won't want to do that because they will just be, kind of a modern-day version of cannon fodder. So there are so many unanswered questions. Honestly, there are many things we don't know than that we do know here in Russia right now, and where things go from here, even after we hear from President Putin, may still not be clear.
It's all very surreal, as you said a moment ago. Keir Simmons. Keir, thank you very much. And joining me now is a staff writer at The New Yorker and author of Surviving Autocracy, Masha Gessen. Masha, it's really good to have you. From your reporting, this turmoil with Prigozhin has been brewing for months. What did you see happening?
Well, what's been emerging in the last few months, and particularly in the last couple of weeks, is suddenly there's a plurality of, well, a sort of plurality of political actors in Russia. This is shocking because Putin has had a monopoly on political action and on violence, especially in Russia, for more than 23 years. So what Russians have seen over the last 48, however many hours, sleepless hours it's been, is something that they have never seen before. There's an entire generation of people who have never seen open debate, open conflict, a kind of politics emerge. And this grew out of a conflict between Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense, a spat that grew more and more public until it finally turned into a confrontation.
You touch on this. We look at what's happening in Russia from a very American perspective, a place where we're used to politics, we're used to debate, we're used to dissent, we're used to choice. And as you mentioned, an entire generation has grown up without any choice in Russia. It's always been Vladimir Putin, and it seems like it always will be Vladimir Putin. Putin is still in charge by all outward appearances. We don't know what's going on with Prigozhin, but this vision of choice out in the open, what is that going to do to Russia in terms of Russians, and then also to Vladimir Putin's hold over the country?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, the simple answer is we don't know. But I think, just you mentioned that we tend to look at it from an American perspective. And one way in which we do that is we focus on statements like Prigozhin saying in one of his initial addresses that sort of on the first day of his mutiny, Prigozhin said that the war was unleashed under false pretenses, that NATO and Ukrainians were not about to attack Russia, contrary to what Russians had heard. But what he was actually saying, right, were two things. One was that he was claiming that the president had been misinformed, that he had been told that NATO and Ukraine were about to attack Russia. And he was also tapping into Russians' deep sense that they're always being lied to, that they're always being misled. So these two things, what's important is not what he said, but sort of how he framed it, right? You've been lied to, both the president and the people. It also underscores that he wasn't actually staging a coup. He very much stayed within this narrative that Putin makes all the decisions, and if Putin made the wrong decision, for example, the way that he has prosecuted the war in Ukraine, then it's because Putin is misinformed. In the statement that Prigozhin released today, and he released this long 11-minute audio statement, sort of claiming that he was responding to all the questions he has received since the mutiny began. In the statement, Prigozhin again said, I was not trying to overthrow the regime, but I was trying to show that we're competent, the Ministry of Defense is incompetent. And he also said that he would have been able to...
Well, it's a smokescreen to the point that it's nothing more than a distraction of taking things off of the original fact that Putin said that they got cheated, and Putin said that they was going to take over the Ukrainian people in just a few days, and Putin said the reason why was because of this, and this. Let's not lose sight of who the instigator in all this is. Let's not be distracted in looking at all the innuendos that, yes, are going on, but we still haven't stayed focused on the originality, the core of origin here of Putin and his oligarchs saying that they got cheated, and his own commander basically has acknowledged that what Putin has done was illegal and insane.
We want to listen.
Civil solidarity shows that any kind of blackmail is doomed to failure. I repeat, there has been a tremendous coming together of society, a unification of society. And there has been a firm support of the constitutional order by all the leading parties, virtually the entirety of Russian society. All of them have been united in the face of the responsibility to defend the homeland. All the necessary decisions were taken as promptly as possible in the light of this danger. The defense of the constitutional order and the lives and security of our citizens. The organizers of this rebellion, cannot but understand that they will be brought to justice. Everybody understands that. This is criminal activity which is aimed at weakening the country, and this was a colossal threat. From outside we are threatened. However, the organizers of this rebellion have betrayed those people who were dragged into this organization. And this kind of suicide is precisely what the neo-Nazis in Kiev and the West wanted. They wanted Russian soldiers should kill each other, that servicemen and civilians be killed. and in the final analysis that Russia should fail. But and they wanted our society to be fragmented, to be splintered. And they tried to take revenge for their failure at the front, but they slipped up. They made a mistake, especially with regard to the special services, which have maintained their oath to the country. The courage, the self-sacrifice of these organs, these bodies, have saved Russia. At the same time, we know that the overwhelming majority of the Wagner company are also patriots of Russia. They have shown their courage in defending Donbass, and yet were encouraged to fight against their compatriots. And by turning back, they avoided further bloodshed. We have to think about the people who actually decided to make this step, which would have had tragic and devastating consequences for the country, for Russia as a whole. I should like to thank those commanders and soldiers of the Wagner private company who took the right decision to stop and go back and prevent bloodshed. And I urge everybody to make contact with the Ministry of Defense or go back to their homes. This promise will be fulfilled. I repeat, it is the choice of each of you that it will be a choice of the warriors of Russia who have acknowledged their fault. President Lukashenko should be thanked also for his role in all this in order to achieve a peaceful resolution. It is the patriotic duty of everyone, the patriotic feeling of everyone, which has saved us and has saved the country as a whole. Thank you.
He talked about being defending their homeland. He wouldn't have to be defending their homeland if they didn't make such a crucial mistake in doing what they've done, number one. Number two, if there was going to be bloodshed pertaining to the militia group that was heading their way, I just imagine it would be a great deal of his people that would be the ones that would be doing the bleeding, okay? But the fact of the matter is he did use the word Western pertaining to some sort of ideology. We never had no type of ideology whatsoever that I'm aware of in attacking or modifying or conforming the Russian or the Russian people. These people, these oligarchs, has already admitted that they had a vendetta, number one. Number two, they felt like they'd been cheated. And number three, they was going back for vengeance and taking back over the property that they felt like that they had rightfully shouldn't have let go of pertaining to over in with the Ukrainians. It's one propaganda ideology right after another, and he don't realize, or for surely God he does, they're not stupid people. They was the ones that initiated this. Putin is the one that drawed first blood. I was hoping that in this meeting that he would say, you know what, it's reached a point that it's not worth it anymore. We're going to call off our troops and we're just going to try to settle this in a diplomatic type way. That's what I was hoping that he was going to say. But instead, all he done was stir the pot. That's all he done. After all this has went on, all he's doing is continually taking the bait and getting further into this.
Okay, so that's Vladimir Putin speaking for the first time publicly in a couple days now since the negotiation to get the Wagner Group to turn around, to get to Yevgeny Prigozhin to go to Belarus, and we learned a lot from when he was staying there, and I don't believe that was live because it started.
The seed's been planted, which is a good thing. The seed's been planted. Open seed has been planted now of retaliating against this maniac. Hopefully that seed will multiply among his own people, and hopefully there will be a takeover. A complete, total takeover. That's the only thing that's going to save the Russian people at this point in time. And if they don't understand that, then maybe they don't deserve to have a country. But their leader, their government, has led them down this bloody path to the point, instead of them retaliating, or I used the wrong word, instead of them reevaluating what they're doing and backing off, they're actually going forward with this. And now they're blaming the Western world. Now they're blaming other people that is embarked up into this ideal towards taking them over. I'm telling you right now, the main perpetrator, which is Lucifer, is sitting back smiling from ear to ear. And he's realizing that they're all taking the bait. And it's just a matter of time before they go to killing themselves. And once they become so weak, once there isn't nothing left, then the true perpetrator will come in and dominate society pertaining to the actual mark of the beast, the Antichrist, the devil himself.
It started in a freeze frame and it ended in a freeze frame. Any kind of blackmail is doomed to failure. That he will hold the organizers accountable. They will be brought to justice. He called it criminal activity. He said it was a threat to the country. They slipped up.
And what about his threat? What about the law that he broke? He went in, he invaded a country that wasn't forming any type of danger to them whatsoever pertaining on this level. They have broken the law. They are the ones that drawed first blood.
And they made a mistake with the security services. He thanked the individual members of the Wagner Group who turned around and left and decided, as he said, not to shed any more blood. He urged them to contact the Ministry of the Defense or to go home. He said it's the choice of each of you. Essentially, join the Russian army or go home. Masha Gesson, you're still with us. What do you make of what you just heard?
It seems that Putin hasn't actually decided what he's going to do. He's keeping his options open. His reference to the Wagner commanders who made the decision to turn around and go home is, I think, purposefully vague. It could even include Prigozhin himself if Prigozhin were to exhibit necessary contrition. Putin also blamed this. He used rhetoric that a leader would normally use when talking about a terrorist attack, right? Which is saying, it's an attack on the whole country, but it's criminal activity, and particularly the blackmail line is very characteristic of talking about terrorists, right? So he is not explicitly saying that this was a coup or an attempted coup. He's treating it as terrorism. I think in his imagination, the best case scenario is that the Wagner Group just basically falls apart. People either go home, as he said, or sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense, which is what the Ministry of Defense was pushing for in the last few months.
And what he don't realize is that the seeds have been planted, and now this will be the opportunity to reform from within. So the next time it happens, they won't back off. The next time it happens, it'll be all knock down, drag out. And I just imagine the leader of that private army that was hired by Putin realized that Putin and his army had the bigger guns, they had the bigger planes, they had the bigger bombs, and it was basically going to be a suicide mission if they pursued their adventure up towards the Kremlin. And that's the reason why that they backed off. Because a tank really don't have no defense pertaining to a fighter in the sky. Don't have a chance.
As it was hoping that the Wagner Group would be disbanded. That does not seem to be a terribly likely outcome. The Wagner Group members, I think, are quite attached to Prigozhin and to the money he pays them. And I think Putin doesn't know what he's going to do if that doesn't happen.
Wow.
Coming out of the streets to purposefully oppose them, quite the opposite than some of the scenes we saw in Rostov. So it's short, it's a bid to show he's back in control again, certainly. It does not mention Yevgeny Prigozhin by name at all, almost like he's a non-person now in Putin's Russia, and that may well be exactly what occurs. And apart from his channel on Telegram where we hear audio messages, he ceases to have a role in the Russian elite. But the impact of what he did over the weekend and how weak it made Vladimir Putin look, well, you can almost see in his face. He looks gaunt, Vladimir Putin. He looks angry, and I think it's been a long time.
He's lost his composure. His composure was being a brutal dictator in being a conqueror. He's lost that composure now, and the rest of the people is going to be able to see that in his expressions and in his face, and because of it, this will be the time to launch a full out-and-out war against Putin and Putin's government. And if Putin don't understand that, it just shows you how malice of a leader that he truly is, because he has led his own people down this road of destruction that could have been avoided. That could have been avoided.
I think it's been a long time, frankly, for him to come forward, make the speech. And yes, it was not a series of very significant statements like it had been trailed to be.
It wasn't so much what he said, but what he didn't say.
Say that Lukashenko doesn't start using Prigozhin against Vladimir Putin, doesn't need Vladimir Putin in the same way that he did a few days ago.
Yeah, I've seen that hypothesis. I don't share it. I think that assumes Lukashenko is more independent than he is. I think he's very dependent on Putin, and not just for military stuff, for all sorts of things. I think what's going on here is they're trying to divide the leadership of Wagner from the fighting forces. So maybe Prigozhin will get to retire in Belarus. I'm not even sure of that. But remember, he's not the only commander of Wagner. There's a whole council, and these are people that have been around for years.
Right.
They're not just people picked out of jails a few months ago. I think he's trying to say that they were the traitors and want to put a division between that council of Wagner leaders and the soldiers. And I'm not sure it's going to be successful, but it seems to me that was the principal message of Putin's address tonight.
And it seems to you that Vladimir Putin does feel threatened by the Wagner Group, that it got through to him.
Yes, absolutely. Why would he give that speech? There's no other reason to give that speech than because he is fearful of him. If everything was going swimmingly and they're all signing up for contracts with the armed forces and laying down their guns and just go along, he wouldn't have to give this speech. I think he is trying to, not to repeat it, but he hasn't succeeded yet in getting them to disband. And so that's why he leaned in to say, you guys are heroes, right? That's what he said, right? You honest soldiers, you are doing the right thing. It's your commanders who are at fault. Again, a complete echo of what Prigozhin said just 3 days ago.
Prigozhin brags about his successes in Ukraine. He brags that he's the only one that's been able to capture any territory in Ukraine, that the Russian army is a mess, they can't do anything. And that's part of the reason why he said he was upset, that he thinks that the head of the army, Sergei Shoigu, is not doing a very good job. Can Vladimir Putin continue to wage war, hold ground in Ukraine without the help of Prigozhin and the Wagner Group?
He can. Wagner's better for offensive things on the ground as opposed to defensive holds. They're now in a defensive posture. But it hurts them, of course. I mean, these are experienced fighters. They did achieve objectives in Bakhmut at a horrific price, by the way. They lost a lot of people there, but they have a reputation for being fighters too. And that, I think, is another difficult thing that Putin is trying to wrestle with. He just can't arrest them all and say they're all traitors, because to many Russians, and including, I think, Russian soldiers, they are heroes because they fought so valiantly in Bakhmut. And so he's trying to do this very delicate dance of saying, you guys are okay, it's your leaders that are at fault, and now we'll have to wait and see how.
And the main leader that's at fault is the president of Russia. And until that internal rollover takes place, and it will, good always succeeds over evil. It may take a while. And maybe these are the things that NATO and America has been waiting for this weakness, for this opportunity, so that they can go gun-ho into this situation. But what worries me is that if it was to turn into an all-out civil war, is Putin, because of his arrogantness, his pride, would he be willing to actually eliminate his competitors by using nuclear warfare, and then after realizing that he's used nuclear warfare on his own people, then using it on the rest of the world? We've got a loose cannon here. It's not necessarily a broken arrow, but it's the next thing to it, if not even worse. At least with a broken arrow, you know what to expect out of whoever broke the arrow. This guy here, he's flip-floppy to the point that you really can't put no faith in anything that he says. He to me, he's reached a level of being a Saddam Hussein, because he has already done proven to others around him that he is willing to take out any and everybody. It don't matter if it's a cousin, don't matter if it's a brother, son, anybody sitting at the same table that he don't like, he'll eliminate them. He'll eliminate them. And that's the KGB standard all along. So whenever the Russian government fell, the internal part of it pertaining to Secret Service, KGB, never did fall. Never did fall. They can paint the horse up any color that they want, but the real working horse is still at work. And you can see that, and that's the reason why Ronald Reagan accused them of being an evil empire. They're evil in their motives and what they're wanting to achieve. And hopefully the rest of the world, as well as his own people, the rest of the good people in Russia, because I know there's good people in Russia that feels the same way, that will say, you know what, enough is enough of this. Because one of the factors that Putin did not put into the elements of his so-called surprise pertaining to artificial intelligence, smartphone technology. And today, we're finding out just exactly what they done and how they done it towards going in and genociding the Ukrainians. We're finding mass graves everywhere where they was trying to cover up their atrocities. Somebody had a phone, and even though the satellite may not have been working directly at that time, once you get a recording of something, you can take it to the next person or the next country and have them put it on their airwaves, and the next thing you know, what you have done now becomes public. Putin did not put that into his equation, and because of it, the world is going to turn against him. The world is going to turn against him because he has brought this upon to his own people.
and see how those soldiers respond.
Ambassador, I'm going to bring in Masha again because I want to get both of your answers on this. But first to you, what do you think this means, Ambassador?
You owe $10,000 or more. You
25,000 and sent them marching toward Moscow. He said that his fighters, who have been fighting on the front lines in Ukraine since the beginning of the war, were given an order to disband, that they were supposed to be incorporated into the Ministry of Defense. And there has been a long rivalry between Wagner and the Ministry of Defense. Prigozhin has accused the Ministry of Defense of denying his men ammunition, of treating them like cannon fodder. He said his men refused to join the regular army and then were attacked. He said they were attacked by helicopter, that 30 of his fighters were killed. At that stage, he said they broke into two columns, one heading to the city of Rostov, where they delivered their weapons, and there is video of them in the city of Rostov being greeted by the locals, in some cases being celebrated and cheered, and the other column heading toward Moscow.
And this is where he is showing weaknesses towards now there's a crack. And usually where there's a crack, it'll turn into a bigger crack. This is where he messed up. He didn't keep those people satisfied. He was using those people. He was treating them like stepchildren, red-headed stepchildren, and they retaliated against him and said, you know what, we're not going to do this. And because of it, the seed now has been planted because it was so big of a seed. Now it's reached their media. So yeah, the crack has even become now even a glacier, a gorge.
Heading toward Moscow. He said they stopped short of Moscow because they achieved their aims. He said the goal was never to topple the government, but was to express their displeasure with the Ministry of Defense and to show how vulnerable Russia had become because of the Ministry of Defense, because of the incompetence of the leadership. And he said, had Wagner been in charge of the war from the beginning, that his men would have been able to march.
Well, he's not a mercenary. He's an oligarch. But the Wagner Group are mercenaries. So it's sort of led, or has been led, or was led by a guy called Dmitry Utkin. He was a retired colonel in Russian special forces. And the reason why people join that world is a mystery, but it's usually one of three reasons. One is that they need the money. And they're ex-soldiers. Or two is they're ex-soldiers and they can't reintegrate into civilian life. Three is they're psychopaths. And four, in the case of the new guard of Wagner, it's this or spend your life in jail. So it's a mysterious calling, and it's a growing calling, and it's a much more dangerous world than most people assume. I think this has been a wake-up call to this trend that's been going on for 20 years.
So where does Prigozhin fall in all of those descriptions?
So Prigozhin is more like in the 30 Years' War in Europe between 1618 and 1648, there was this guy called Wallenstein who was really just a financier. And he created sort of regiments for Emperor Ferdinand II, who was fighting in this 30 Years' War. But he became so rich, so political, and had armies at his back that the emperor assassinated Wallenstein in his sleep. And I think Prigozhin's a similar model. He himself is not a former soldier. He's a businessman whose business happens to be war. He's a war entrepreneur. And I think that he's also super ambitious. And despite all the recent mixed signals coming out of Moscow, I don't think his desire for political ambition has waned any. And since he's got an army at his back, he's actually quite political in the situation.
So war entrepreneur, that's burnished by reporting that my colleague Richard Engel has done on what Yevgeny Prigozhin is doing around the world, especially in Africa, working with leaders of not so stable African countries and helping prop them up while also mining the vast natural resources that they can get, getting diamonds, et cetera, lumber, making money off of it, also shipping a lot of that money back to Russia to help fund the war in Ukraine. So a lot of what the Wagner Group does for Russia is not just, pure brawn, doing it in Syria as well, not just the muscle, Mark, but it's also a lot of finances. I imagine this complicates things for somebody like Vladimir Putin.
It does. I mean, the truth is,
Mark, go ahead.
So the way we looked at the Wagner Group, I left government in 2019, and so things might have changed a bit. But look, the Wagner Group was an extension of the GRU, of Russian military intelligence. They trained together. They certainly received equipment from them. And so calling them a private military contractor, in some sense, we kind of think of, the equivalent of a Blackwater in the United States. And I think it's a little bit, it's actually vastly different. And so Vladimir Putin would use Wagner as an extension for Russian foreign policy. And, they did so in a lot of conflicts around the world, which would give the Russians a foothold, but also would, as you noted, Katie, bring back some type of wealth. The one thing that I like to remind viewers is back in 2018 in the deserts in Syria, there was an exchange between Wagner forces and the U.S. Special Forces from the Joint Special Operations Command. Wagner forces, in essence, picked a fight with us, and the end result was 300 dead Wagner forces. So, in the sense, they're not 10 feet tall when going up against, something like the U.S. Special Operations Command, but they are very useful to Russia. And I think that this does affect kind of Russian, when you kind of foreign policy, kind of active measures overseas. This will be a bit of a dent to kind of Vladimir Putin's ambitions globally.
Sean, did you want to jump in on that also?
I do. I would disagree slightly with that. This is not an extension of the GRU. They are not statutory forces. They're not a covert militia. They are mercenaries. And right now, for all we know, Prigozhin could be entering dialogue with Zelensky to get off the battlefield in exchange for payment. These are not under control of Putin. We saw that clearly in the last 48 hours, 72 hours. And while they may not be a threat to United States of America, that's not the question. 40,000, 50,000 Wagner Group army, I mean, they're the second best army in Ukraine. All the big victories, well, call them big, but all the victories in Soledar and Bakhmut are really done by the Wagner Group. And so if right now, if they leave the fight, then Russia's going to have a hard time winning Ukraine. It's just going to prolong whatever is going to happen. But I do think that they are an X factor. And if they actually do leave Ukraine, they could go on to Africa, where they already have, they support extractive industry. Also, Prigozhin owns the troll factory, the
IRA.
The cyber war. Yeah, the IRA, and he uses them together, and he offers this to places like Sudan and to Mali. So it's a twofer. You get the Wagner Group on the ground, and you get the cyber aspects from St. Petersburg. So he doesn't need Moscow. He can actually go his own way. Moscow might try to kill him, and he might try to kill Moscow, but he's a kind of an independent actor. I don't think he's a militia of GRU per se.
Sleep with one eye open. Mark, I want to ask you about intelligence. We don't have the greatest, from as I understand it, the greatest visibility inside of Russia. Does a situation like this present an opportunity?
Well, there's enormous opportunities on this. And look, this is the Super Bowl for the intelligence community right now, and it certainly looks like, within the last week, there were some warnings. So, the IC did kind of accomplish that function. There were briefings to the Gang of Eight over the weekend that something was brewing. But here's where things get interesting now. In times of crisis like this, a lot of people talk. And so there's going to be kind of laser focus on Russian regime communications, whether it's the presidential administration, whether it's the Russian military, because people are going to want to determine the loyalty. And at the same time, at U.S. embassies around the world, there's a welcome mat. There's a shingle being laid out for any Russians who see the chaos back home and who want to kind of take that step. So there are certainly opportunities for U.S. intelligence. It's hard. Russia is a hard target. It's an autocratic regime. It's hard to get in there. But from our ability to in fact call or predict the Russian invasion of Ukraine to what it looks like that we picked up Prigozhin moves, I think we're doing okay. Always opportunity and room to get better. And of course, one last piece on this, Katie, it's really important. The U.S. intelligence community will be laser focused on kind of the Russian nuclear arsenal and the security posture. That is going to be prime of what President Biden and the National Security Council are looking at the IC to monitor. And this is standard collection, so I'm sure they're on that right now.
The largest nuclear arsenal in the world belongs to Russia, not exactly the country you want to be unstable. And just to button up our breaking news, Vladimir Putin has spoken for the first time in a couple days, and he addressed the would-be rebellion, whatever you want to call it, directly, saying that blackmail is doomed to failure. He also said he's going to hold the organizers accountable, that it's criminal, but he also said he thanks the members of the Wagner Group who decided to turn around and told them either join the Ministry of Defense, join the Russian army, or go home. Left enough wiggle room, according to our experts, to say that could also include Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is the leader of the Wagner Group. We will see what happens next. Mark Palomaropoulos and Sean McFate, thank you very much for joining us. Ahead, the quote, very real 2024 threat that Democrats are worried about. First up, though, an NBC.
He has demonstrated weakness of his regime. He called for help and support to leaders of Belarus, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkey. And this is probably the first time in the history of Russia that any leader of the country, from Muscovite times through the Russian Empire times, through the USSR, to the current Russian regime, would call for support for leaders of those countries. Okay. And as we all know, Mr. Erdogan has suggested he's mediated services to Mr. Putin for solving the internal political crisis within the country.
Okay.
That is
Andre, let me just jump in, if I may. Let me just jump in, if I may. And the test now becomes, in your view, does he crack down? Is his strength sufficiently weakened that he is able, if you like, to regain all the reins of power with some form almost like Stalinist crackdown?
I think it's too early to make the final conclusion about that, but it seems to me this is definitely public simulation. But the essence of the regime seems to me still intact. The military forces, security forces, all do operate. Certainly some people from Mr. Putin's personal entourage demonstrated their weakness, even left Moscow. By the way, Mr. Putin himself left Moscow in anticipation of this march of Mr. Prigozhin. But at this moment, I would say it's too early to say that there is any serious crack in the regime. It has demonstrated weakness, but it is too far from any fateful decisions and fateful consequences.
I'm going to leave it there. That's going to be the end of this particular program. I am going to voice my opinion about all this. I personally believe the man is doomed. His doom has now been sealed, pertaining to the crack that's going to turn into a glacier. It's going to turn into a gorge. And the reason why is because the The Russian people have been through so much. They have lost children, they've lost brothers, they've lost dads, they've lost uncles. They lost the benefit of going to McDonald's and other privileges that they had that they don't have. They've had to go through extreme hard times. And the fact that the telephone, internet, etc., I think the man's doomed. I think he's doomed. I may be wrong. It's not a prediction. But I'm just saying that if the Russian government wants to survive this, they're going to have to get rid of their main spokesman. They're going to have to get rid of their flag barrier to be their example, because I think that he has overstepped his boundaries. He knows now that he's been captured or caught red-handed. Everybody knows that he was the one that went after the Ukrainians, that become bloodthirsty, that's going to look like the tyrant that he is. He's basically now considered an enemy of not just the state, but an enemy of the world. And there's going to have to be some answers. There's going to have to be some accountability issues pertaining to all this. You don't go in and slaughter men, women, and children and think that you can walk away and be scot-free. We don't know who it was that masterminded all this, but whoever it was is fixing to come to their own fate. That's going to be the only way for Russia to pick up the pieces and to move on in the global society. Other than that, they will be isolated for the rest of their days. And if they can't see that, then maybe they don't deserve to have a country. Kind of like the Afghanistan people. If the Afghanistan people, after us going over and training them and reforming them and telling them how to pull the trigger, if they wasn't willing to fight the Taliban, maybe they don't deserve to have a country. I don't know. And I hate to say that because of so many innocent lives that got destroyed of the Afghanistan deal, and it's still being destroyed because of the wickedness of the Taliban, the jihad, basically the terrorist over there. Good luck to all of us. Good luck to all of us, and God bless America, and God bless our troops. I'm so thankful that I am an American and that we still have our freedoms because of not just what our ancestors had done, but what even to this day the patriots of this country are willing to do if deemed necessary. Thank you for listening. God bless us all pertaining to our endeavors going forward. God bless America. God bless our troops. Heaven help us all, and shalom.